Welcome to this explainer. So, have you ever wondered what actually happens when a massive educational reform hits a brick wall of systemic reality? Well, today we're taking a pretty critical, data-driven look at the Philippine K-12 educational reform. This was a monumental policy shift. It was totally designed to bring the country's education system right up to global standards. But, as we're about to see, designing a great structure on a piece of paper is incredibly different from executing it in an actual classroom. Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover 1. The K-12 promise, 2. Access without completion, 3. Progression without mastery, 4. The execution gap, and finally, fixing the system. All right, let's jump right into section 1, the K-12 promise, intent versus outcomes. I want you to think about this for a second. Does more time in school automatically equal more learning? The whole fundamental assumption behind the K-12 reform was basically that by structurally extending basic education, adding those extra senior high school years, the Philippines would naturally align with global standards. And honestly, the intent was completely noble. They wanted to enhance learning outcomes, boost global competitiveness, and make sure graduates were actually ready to be employed. But, as the source material makes super clear, relying purely on structural changes to fix deep-seated educational issues, that's a deeply flawed premise. There is just a wild expectation versus reality gap here. These stated policy goals of the reform were all about creating globally competitive, highly employable graduates. But then there's the uncomfortable truth. Recent international assessments, specifically the 2018 PISA results, placed the Philippines in the absolute bottom tier globally. A majority of students were failing to meet even the bare minimum proficiency levels in reading and math. So they modernized the structure, sure, but they clearly didn't modernize the actual learning. Moving on to Section 2, Access without completion, the systemic leaks. According to 2023 Department of Education data, the junior high school cohort survival rate hovers between 84 and 86%. Now, at first glance, that might sound okay, right? But think about what that actually means on the ground. It means roughly 10 to 15% of students are just falling through the cracks before they even reach senior high. In a system built entirely on the promise of universal access, losing that many kids is a massive, massive systemic inefficiency. And guys, the leak gets even worse. The dropout rate for senior high school jumps to 10% or higher. And the source data points out something absolutely crucial here. This attrition isn't just random. It disproportionately hits learners from low-income households, rural communities, and kids who already have weak foundational skills. So while K-12 successfully expanded enrollment and essentially got more kids inside the school building, it absolutely has not solved the underlying equity issues that forced them to drop out in the first place. Getting them in the door, that's literally only half the battle. This really brings the overall crisis into focus. The country has built a system that enrolls students efficiently, but fails to actually educate them completely. System participation is high, student completion is only moderate because of those systemic leaks we just talked about. But the most alarming part? Actual learning remains incredibly low. Which brings us to Section 3, Progression without mastery, advancing without learning. Progression without mastery is honestly perhaps the most harmful systemic failure hiding behind those seemingly okay retention numbers. It's basically the illusion of an education. When students are simply pushed through to the next grade level without mastering essential skills, those learning gaps don't just disappear, they compound year after year. It totally masks the real crisis behind superficial measures of access, and ultimately, it hinders the entire country's human capital development. A 2024 review by Basilio really hits the nail on the head here. It notes that extended schooling has not produced corresponding gains in literacy and numeracy. We're just seeing this glaring inefficiency, where increased inputs, meaning more years, more time in the seat, more curriculum, simply do not yield proportional outputs in what a student can actually do. The structure got bigger, but the fundamental mastery of reading and math was completely left behind. Let's dive into Section 4, the execution gap, the Vietnam foil. Now, you might be thinking, well, isn't this just a lack of funding? This comparison builds an undeniable case against that very common excuse. The Philippines spends about 3.5 to 4% of its GDP on education, which, yes, is below the UNESCO recommendation. But surprisingly, Vietnam actually spends less per student. Yet they consistently achieve significantly higher PISA scores. It's a pretty devastating contrast. It proves that raw budget numbers aren't the whole story. Vietnam's success points to a stronger, much more coherent instructional system and far better teacher deployment. Execution and instructional quality absolutely trump purely structural spending. As Bernardo pointed out back in 2020, instructional challenges arise when curriculum reforms are introduced without corresponding investments in teacher capacity. You literally cannot just mandate a shiny new globally aligned curriculum from the top down and expect magic to happen. The teachers are the ones who actually have to deliver it. If they aren't equipped, trained, and supported to handle these new pedagogical approaches, the curriculum is totally useless. That implementation gap, that is the real villain here. All right, let's wrap things up with Section 5, Fixing the System, from Structure to Instruction. The good news is the source material doesn't just point out all these flaws. It offers some really concrete solutions. First, there needs to be a massive shift from structural reform over to instructional reform, basically setting clear national standards for teaching quality. Second, we need outcome-based accountability. Schools shouldn't be judged just on how many kids enroll, but on actual, measurable learning gains linked to benchmarks like PISA. Third, the system has to stop spreading resources evenly and start targeting them directly to the underserved regions that actually need them most. And finally, if we want employable graduates, we've got to strengthen industry education linkages, literally bringing employers right into the curriculum design process. Remember those massive dropout leaks we talked about earlier? To fix those, the sources recommend a big shift from reactive to proactive monitoring. Right now, the system reacts after a student drops out. Instead, what's needed is a local dropout risk monitoring system. Step 1, actively track early risk indicators like sudden drops in attendance or dipping grades. Step 2, when a student hits a specific risk threshold, boom, the system triggers an automatic alert. Step 3, the school immediately deploys targeted intervention before the student actually disengages. And this intervention has to start incredibly early. The data is clear. Student dropout patterns frequently start from unresolved learning gaps in the very first years of schooling. By setting up mandatory literacy and numeracy benchmarks in grades 1 through 3 and giving immediate help to kids who fall behind, we stop those gaps from compounding. The research suggests this kind of early grade intervention could drastically reduce future dropout rates by 30 to 40%. If you fix the foundation, the house stops crumbling. Finally, we absolutely have to talk about the teachers. Instructional quality is the single most influential factor in student learning. But right now, teachers are drowning in paperwork. The reform proposes intentionally cutting that non-instructional workload. If we can slice out about 25% of those administrative tasks through better automation and clearer role boundaries, we liberate educators. All that time gets reallocated back to what actually matters: teaching, lesson planning, and structured instructional coaching. Which leaves us with this final, really vital question. The K-12 program was a totally necessary structural modernization, for sure, but its promise is still just aspirational. Will we continue to simply fund a structure, just counting enrollees and tracking passing grades that hide a total lack of mastery? Or will we finally invest in the execution, actually empowering teachers, enforcing real accountability, and ensuring that every single year spent in a classroom results in genuine, lasting learning? The structure is built. Now it's time to actually educate. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this helped clarify the massive gap between educational expectation and reality. Keep learning, and I'll see you next time.